And Nas also in the reading brings up this idea of a paradoxical criteria. He's mainly talking about the Masterpieces program, which is the nickname for the proclamation of the oral and intangible heritage, again, of humanity. These lists were inscribed in 2001, 2003, 2005. In 2006, those 3 lists became part of the representative list. That is one of the instruments of the convention. And at the time, and perhaps these criteria still exist, we can think about this, intangible cultural expressions have to be of outstanding value, so hence that masterpieces idea, also that representative idea. But at the same time, they're on the brink of extinction. And he argues that's quite contradictory. If something is on the brink of extinction, that means it's not being valued, right? So how can they be both? If it is safeguarded and thriving like the 3 examples from the northeast of England, I argue they're safeguarded. They're in the hands of their communities, under community control. They decide about standards, developments in style, techniques through competitions, etc. They're safeguarded. They're not on the brink of extinction, so they wouldn't make it on this list. And is this the same criteria for national inventories and again the international representative and urgent lists? Does this criteria still exist? So briefly, I'll just go over come from the legal angle, which is really part of the history of this convention and this framework. So originally, as Montira mentioned yesterday, this was a WIPO problem, intangible cultural heritage, or as it was called in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, up until about 2002, the term intangible heritage was born during the drafting of the convention, although of course it's existed before that. But this idea of traditional culture was seen as, it was felt that intellectual property laws could be applied to traditional culture. The only problem was that with a lot of folk traditions and intangible cultural expressions, there really isn't one author. So who gets the ownership? Who gets the intellectual property rights? So that's a bit problematic. So eventually, it became a culture issue. This is why UNESCO is the leading global force for safeguarding intangibles. This really happened in the early 90s and on. WIPO decided, you know what, UNESCO, you handle this issue of safeguarding heritage of a living nature. However, WIPO is still consulted, et cetera, to this day. Some scholars pinpoint the birth of this intangible cultural heritage concept to a 1973 letter from the Bolivian Ministry of Culture to WIPO and UNESCO at the time concerning the protection of traditional culture. It's been pinned down to one song. It's an Andean folk song called El Condor Pasa from the Bolivian part of side of the Andes. This was a song that was appropriated by a famous American singing group, Simon and Garfunkel. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. This song was part of an internationally best-selling album. They made lots of money. It could be argued the Bolivian government didn't like that they made money, and they didn't. And so they really did, from this song and realizing that traditional culture can be picked up and chosen from around the world and used for other purposes, particularly commercial purposes, this idea of protecting traditional culture and tangible heritage really grew from this. So the legal considerations really are that we must protect our traditional expressions from appropriation, exploitation, commercialization from others commercializing heritage that you feel is yours. That's important to realize. Now, briefly onto some museological considerations. However, Dr. Krebs will be talking more about the relationship between museums and intangible heritage. I just want to note that at the international level, the museum sector really has embraced this idea of intangible cultural heritage. One of the key moments was in 2004. The Declaration of Seoul was adopted. This is the official endorsement by ICOM, International Council of Museums, endorsing the 2003 convention. So really this is the early 2000s and up to 2004, that really was when the museums museums worldwide were being called into this international movement to safeguard intangibles. And one of the participants at the ICOM General Conference in 2004 noted that museums now function as an oxygen mask for local cultures which are slowly suffocating to death. A rather grim idea, again, this idea of death and globalization and impending loss, but also that museums need to museum professionals need to leave the museum and go out there and try to save all this living heritage. One of the key quotes from this conference was when Curran noted that museums are generally poor institutions for safeguarding tangible heritage. This is because traditionally they have dealt with tangible heritage. But the only problem is there's no better institution within society to do so. So we really need to turn to museums. This was the argument at the time. It still is being argued. I have a little picture here. How do you bring living heritage into the museum context? How do you bring the rapper dancers into a glass case, metaphorical glass case? This is the idea of fossilizing heritage, living heritage, making it dead within that museological, traditional museological context. And now just quickly mention at the local level, so that was the international level, this embracing of the intangible heritage idea. Well, from my own research in the northeast of England, what are the feelings and thoughts and attitudes about intangible cultural heritage? From my research at 12 museums, talking to high-level professionals, all different museums, large, small, dealing with regional heritage or more local heritage. There's in general this discomfort with the ICH idea. What was being associated with intangible heritage during my interviews was this notion of living history. So traditions that don't exist anymore, but they're from the past, reenacting them as intangible heritage. That is intangible heritage, the actual reenactments, and I wouldn't disagree with that. Also, intangible heritage was thought of as the stories, the meanings, the values that are associated and anchored by material culture. So you have an object, and intangible heritage is all that information that surrounds that object that museum curators and other professionals try to interpret and bring out in exhibitions and what have you. Again, I wouldn't argue that that's not intangible heritage. However, what about contemporary expressions, that especially the three that I study, that are living and thriving outside the walls of these museums? So it's interesting, this idea of the past as intangible heritage at the local level of Northeast England. So we'll move on to some anthropological considerations, particularly this idea of folklorization. And I'll really focus on that case study, that research that De Jong presented in the chapter. It's in your reading. I really recommend reading that. It's a really interesting study. It's one of the only studies of an intangible cultural expression that has been transformed because of UNESCO intervention. The expression is called the Conquerong Masquerade. It was nominated to be on that Masterpieces program and was selected, so now it's part of the representative list. In 2004 this happened. One of the vital aspects of this intangible cultural expression is the notion of secrecy. Now early on in the chapter he mentioned that there was some state, national government intervention. Senegal and the Gambia also tried to preserve the idea of secrecy. I'm just going to really talk about UNESCO. But please, again, read this chapter, it's great. In any case, after UNESCO intervention, this publicizing of a local, regional expression to an international audience, this expression became more visible. It was publicized. It was reproduced in photographs. And this was forbidden within the local context of this expression. The masked figure parades through villages. If he catches you looking at him, he can come after you and threaten to beat you with a stick. Only certain people could look at this character, this figure. It's a ritual as well, initiation for young men to become older adults. And so really, through UNESCO intervention, this core aspect of the expression was diminished. It became more visible. It's not secret anymore, private, or unseen. And also became a tourist destination. So again, that multiplied and the effect of visibility. There was tourist merchandise, postcards, photographs of this figure, sculptures, etc. So in an effort to safeguard it, it was transformed.